Children's Types by Douglas M. Borland. Condition Group 2. The pioneer of homeopathy, Dr. Douglas Morris Borland, explained 6 basic homeopathic medicines for poor physical and mental growth of children in his book Children's Types. His way of explaining medicines is unique and very interesting. In this chapter, he included 6 medicines: Baryta carbonica, borax, Natrum muriaticum, sepia, aurum metallicum, and carbo vegetabilis. Out of these 6 medicines, I am going to read first 2 important medicines, Baryta carbonica and borax, in this video. I will upload the next video of the remaining medicines as early as possible. Baryta carbonica. The second group are all very much of the same type. They all apply more or less to the backward child, either a case of delayed development or a definite mental defective. The outstanding drug in this group is Baryta carbonica, which is more typical of the backward child than any other drug in our materia medica. The characteristics of the Baryta carb child are very definite. It is a dwarfish child, dwarfish mentally and physically. I have never seen a Baryta carb child who was up to the standard height, but they may be up to the standard weight. The next glaring characteristic is that the Baryta carb child is always an excessively shy child. That shy characteristic covers quite a lot of the Baryta carb child. It is nervous of strangers, scared of being left alone. Very often it is terrified of going out of doors. A town-bred child going to the country is terrified in the open fields. They often get night terrors without any clear idea of what the terror is, and they always have a fear of people. Another characteristic linked with that fear of people is that the Baryta carb children are always touchy. They do not like being interfered with. They are easily irritated. The next thing is that throughout their lives they have been late in everything: late in speaking, late in walking, late in dentition, slow in gaining weight. Another marked feature is an exaggeration of the normal child's forgetfulness. Every child is forgetful, every child is inattentive, but in the Baryta carb child this is very much exaggerated. If they are playing, they never stick to it for any length of time. They pick up a toy, play with it, and drop it. You may hold their attention for a minute or two. Then they turn round and look at the nurse or mother or whoever happens to be there. They pick up a thing from your desk and fumble with it for a minute or two, and the next moment they are playing with the handle of a drawer. It is that lack of concentration that is the outstanding characteristic. As they get older, the same report comes from the school. The child is inattentive, never concentrates on lesson, appears to learn something today and has completely forgotten it tomorrow. The mother would teach the child its alphabet a dozen times over, and 10 minutes after it knew it, it would be allowed to go out and play, and half an hour later it was all forgotten. Another thing is that they are very easily tired out. Any attempt at sustained effort exhausts them. When they are young, they become cross and irritable. As they get older, any sustained effort brings on very troublesome headaches, usually a frontal headache with a feeling as if the forehead were bulging and sitting right down over the eyes, and it is awful effort for them to keep the eyes open. The next point about them, and it is pretty constant to all the Baryta carb children, is that they are liable to get colds, and their colds are characteristic. They always start as a sore throat, and the most Baryta carb children have hypertrophied tonsils. To the hypertrophy of their tonsils can be linked the other glandular tissues. The Baryta carb child very probably has enlarged cervical glands, possibly enlarged abdominal glands. With the enlarged abdominal glands linked the fact that the child stands badly, there is often marked lordosis and a very prominent abdomen. With the abdomen condition is the symptom that the Baryta carb child is usually worse after eating. more inattentive, more irritable, more touchy, and very often more tired after eating. The next thing about them linked with the tonsillar hypertrophy is that if that get enlarged tonsils and get cold, they are very liable to develop a quinsy. Here is a tip that is worth remembering. To a typical Baraita carb child with an acute tonsillitis, it is wiser to give a dose of Baraita muriatica rather than Baraita carb during the acute phase, and very often they will need an intercurrent dose of sorainum after the Baraita mure before reverting to Baraita carb. It is quite easy to talk on the sorainum to the Baraita carb because many of these children tend to get a crusty skin eruption on the head and crusty margins to the eyelids. They may have a definite blepharitis, and most Baraita carb children are worse from washing, all of which are definite sorainum symptoms also. They are very liable to get intensely irritable skin eruptions but with intense irritation, and that again is liable to be worse after they have been bathed. As would be expected with that type of child with low physique, they are chilly, or if are exposed to cold, their tonsils become affected. One other feature of Baraita carb children is a marked tendency to salivation. Dribbling is a common characteristic of mentally defective children. Above are the keynotes to the mentally defective group of drugs, and of these, Baraita carb is by far the most commonly indicated. Following that come other drugs mentioned previously, starting with borax. The feature that makes one consider whether a child is a Baraita carb or borax type is the manner in which the child is frightened. They are both scared children and they are very often quite similar to look at. But whereas in the Baraita carb child, anything strange in its surroundings scares it, in the borax child it is any sudden noise in its vicinity which simply terrifies it. The tendency to the salivation and dribbling is equally marked in borax, but in the majority of borax children one is dealing with a definite stomatitis, and associated with the salivation there are white spots on the tongue, pearly spot around the margins of the tongue, spots on the lips and on the sides of the cheeks. There is a very similar history in regard to night terrors in the borax child, but there is usually an exciting cause in these cases. The child has been doing too much during the day or has been overexcited in the evening, and then it is almost sure to have marked night terror. With the borax child, there is not the same degree of inability to learn. The child is simply idle. If he would give his heart to it, he could learn, but he is just idle. These children never settle to anything, and even at play, they do not persevere but get bored and change from one thing to another. Another thing that distinguishes from Baraita carb type is that borax children are much more irritable, and their irritability does not end up in weeping as it very often does in Baraita carb, but it ends up in a violent passion. The child kicks and screams. The next point which distinguishes the borax child from Baraita carb child is that the Baraita carb child tends to get a generalized skin eruption or a very definite crusty eruptions on the scalp, but the borax child is much more likely to get herpetic eruptions, very often herpetic spots about the lips or a generalized rash of small herpetic spots on the body. Borax cases are also more liable to get acute digestive upsets than Baraita carb types, which have the typical chronic constipation, the hard stool. Borax is liable to sudden attacks of diarrhea and vomiting. Another characteristic of borax which distinguishes it from Baraita carb is the peculiar borax sensitiveness of fruit, with violent colic after eating fruit, colic followed by diarrhea. Associated with the tendency to inflammation of mucous membranes, acute stomatitis, etc., it is very common in borax children to find either enuresis or pain on micturition. Pain on micturition is much more common, and very often it is without any definite urinary infection. Another thing that distinguishes the Baraita carb child when a little older is that the Baraita carb child gets depressing frontal headache from overstudy, whereas the borax child tends to become sick and tends to get definite nausea from intense concentration. Then there is the final clinching points in connection with the borax child, and that is the notorious borax aggravation from downward motion. Bradycarp children often get train sick. Borax children will get train sick and car sick too, but borax children have a peculiar terror of downward motion, and it is the terror much more than the actual feeling of discomfort which is the characteristic of borax children. It occurs in numerous circumstances. The typical pointer is the child who screams time it is laid down in bed if the nurse does not lower it very gently. But it is equally marked in older children who scream on going down in a lift. It is the peculiar terror rather than the physical discomfort which distinguishes borax from any other drug. One useful practical tip is in connection with air sickness. There are various drugs for train sickness and sea sickness, but borax acts in majority of cases of air sickness because it is the sudden dip which upsets most people, and particularly the terror of falling. Air sickness has been completely overcome by 3 or 4 doses of borax before traveling by air. Borax is likely bradycarp in being sensitive to cold, but it has much more sensitiveness to damp than bradycarp. Borax is one of the sodium salts, and immediately one considers the sodium salts one thinks of the possibility of the others, and by far the most commonly indicated of these is natrium muriaticum.